The Middle East was ahead of its time, but in a sort of unexpected way. During the Arab Spring, the region was struggling with many of the same questions that Americans are contending with today. And some of them include, what does it mean to be a citizen of a nation? In the context of the Middle East, the question would be, what does it mean to be Egyptian? What does it mean to be Jordanian? What is the role of religion in public life? What are the ends of society? Is the final endpoint of human progress liberalism? Or is it something else? And if the latter, what does that something else look like? Here in the Middle Eastern context, when we talk about alternatives to liberalism, the something else, when we talk about anti-liberals and post-liberals, we're talking about Islamist movements. Islamists are those who believe that Islam or Islamic law should play a central role in public life. For the purposes of this video essay, I'm referring here mostly to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, what we sometimes call mainstream Islamist groups. They are deeply conservative, even reactionary, but they are not revolutionary. They participate in the political process. They don't have armed wings, and they participate in the parliamentary process as well and form political parties and so forth. It's interesting, I didn't used to use the word post-liberal when describing Islamist groups. It's actually a loan word from American political debates, especially today. I mean, post-liberalism is all the rage among Christian conservatives, including integralists, evangelicals, and also national conservatives of various stripes. But it was actually Islamists who were carrying the banner of post-liberalism before post-liberalism was cool. So now we can take a step back after several decades of Islamist movements having this experience with post-liberalism in the Middle East. How did it all turn out? What can we learn from mistakes, flaws? And some of those flaws might have been fatal, as we'll soon find out. But before we get into the contents of this mixed bag, some historical background is in order. The first thing to say about Islamism, if we really want to understand the concept, is that it is new. It is not some pre-modern thing. It is not a return to the 7th century. In fact, centuries ago, 4 or 5 centuries ago, let's say, if you had said the word Islamism in Arabic, people would have returned blank stares because they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. In the pre-modern period, Islamism did not exist because it didn't need to exist. Islam already provided an overarching moral, religious, and legal architecture. No one questioned that source of legitimacy. It went without saying, so it wasn't said. But then something happened. In the 19th century, we have the introduction of secular ideologies, and these gained traction in the Middle East. Some of that is through colonialism, some of that is through travel and media and just the exchange of ideas. And the introduction of this secular alternative creates a new sort of tension that for the first time, those with an Islamic orientation or worldview are on the defensive. For the first time, they have to make an argument for something that was previously self-evident. And this requires a different approach. How do you do this? How do you make an argument for something you thought was self-evident just maybe decades ago, and now you're being pushed and forced to justify yourself? So what happened is, in the early 20th century, a group of Islamic thinkers who are known as the Islamic modernists, they commit themselves to making Islam relevant again, or if you will, making Islam great again. They want to show naysayers that Islam is rational, practical, and compatible with modernity. One of the great thinkers in this mold was Rashid Rida, who wrote an entire book of apologetics demonstrating the inherent rationality of Islam in contrast to Christianity, which he saw as otherworldly and mystical. For Rida, he says, Islam is, quote unquote, the religion of reason. It is the ally of the sciences. It is nearer to mankind's innate disposition and intelligence. And then he advises readers in another place, you may come to know your religion's truths through logical proof and evidence. If this sounds like an odd way to talk about religion, then you wouldn't be alone, because religion is about faith. There should be some mystery. Not everything has to be clear. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. Rashid Rida and these other early Islamic thinkers in the 20th century, they were overcompensating because Muslims were weak and they were still under the grip of colonial rule, and then everyone was talking about how Islam is backward and retrograde. So they wanted to go out of their way to show this rational face. In the intellectual lineage, after Rida comes the Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in 1928, the oldest and largest Islamist movement in the world, with branches and affiliates across the globe. And the Brotherhood draws directly from the premises of the modernists. They try to streamline Islam even more, making it as practical as possible. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, actually wrote a little pamphlet titled, Are We Practical People? ? And of course, presumably the answer to this was yes. The way the Brotherhood talks about Islam is instructive. For the Brotherhood, Islam becomes a project to be applied. This is what adds the ism to Islam. And they actually begin to use this phrase in Arabic that translates as the Islamic project. And let's just think about that for a moment. What does it mean to make a religion into a project? To be self-consciously doing that. That is something that is distinctly modern. And that is something the Brotherhood introduces. They are providing a practical program for everyday Muslims that makes Islam relevant in what they do and how they perceive the world around them. Another phrase, which translates as the implementation of Sharia. This is also an interesting kind of phrasing, and the Brotherhood uses it time and time again. The application of Sharia, the application of Sharia. But to think of the law as something to be applied in this kind of operational sense is also a distinctly modern way of looking at things. So to kind of take a step back and zoom out, if I had to sum up the Islamist project, I describe it as the effort to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with the modern nation state. But by definition, it is difficult to square a circle. And that's essentially what Islamists were trying to do. The pre-modern and the modern don't always go together. There isn't always a way to reconcile them. So there is this kind of inherent tension that lingers. And moreover, the state, as it turns out, got the better end of the stick in the deal. Islamist parties came to accept so many of modernity's assumptions that they couldn't think beyond it. They couldn't think beyond the state. In fact, they came to terms with the nation state. They accepted that politics would be organized along quote-unquote rational lines. Their conception of Islamic law was modernized as well. In the pre-modern period, Islamic law couldn't be found in any one particular place. It was rich, diverse, and decentralized. And as I mentioned, the Brotherhood, in contrast, saw the law as something to be applied. Well, that raises the question, who would apply it? The nation state. How would it be applied? Well, it would have to be codified first and made digestible through written statutes. That is a real innovation in how Sharia is perceived. What does it mean to take a decentralized corpus of law that is really the collective sum experience of hundreds of years of intellectual and theological inquiry and to try to boil it down to a sheet of laws? This was a distinctly modern and Western conception of law that the Brotherhood was adopting. We might not realize it as such because we as Westerners, we as moderns, this is the kind of law that we're most familiar with here in America. But there are other ways of conceptualizing legal traditions. As it turns out, as we're seeing, the state is a very powerful concept, and it has its own secularizing logic. So let's fast forward to the Arab Spring.
It was the year of people power, of revolution, and bloodshed that doomed dictators. That set off a movement that kicked out longtime President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali. A region was gripped with freedom fever. Fueled by social media, protests erupt in Algeria, then Yemen.
If we look at Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, or Ennahda in Tunisia, they're good at getting out the vote and winning elections and presenting themselves as moderate for Western audiences. But then, when they have to run a state, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, they're dealing with large, unwieldy, and unreformed state structures. And those state structures eat them up, in a sense. And they are overwhelmed by these overly bureaucratized states. And it's no surprise that a loan phrase, the deep state, that we now use in the American context actually comes from Turkey and Egypt. That's where it started. These states that almost take on a life of their own. They are perpetually around you. You cannot escape them. And so when these post-liberal Islamists or anti-liberal Islamist parties come to power and have to govern, then the tension arises. And the tension actually intensifies. The interesting thing is that even as these Islamist parties are domesticated by the overwhelming nature of the state, that doesn't make them particularly well-liked or admired by their critics. Liberals and secularists still fear them as much as ever. And that's a really interesting point here. They fear them not necessarily for what they are doing in the moment, but what they might potentially do at some unspecified point in the future. Because even if these Islamist parties are doing moderate things, they're not really implementing any Islamic laws, whatever those might be, there's still going to be a fear that they're hiding their true intentions, that they're biding their time, and at some point they will move in and they will realize these more far-reaching fantasies of Islamic rule. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of how, Mitt Romney, in retrospect at least, was a pretty moderate Republican presidential candidate. But even though he was a nice guy and didn't generally say very crazy things, his opponents still used this kind of apocalyptic language.
They're going to put you all back in chains.
Frankly, I don't understand. I mean, I'm obviously a card-carrying Democrat, but I can't understand why any woman would want to vote for Mitt Romney except maybe Mrs. Romney.
Those wealth gaffes, the 47% tape, all of that stuff. Surely the Republican Party could do better than that, right?
With ideological movements, if you try to move to the center, it may not be very persuasive because people will still have a particular perception of the overall movement, the conservative movement, the Republican Party. And this became self-defeating for Islamist movements. They weren't doing much that was Islamic. Well, they didn't really actually rule for all that long. In Egypt, we're talking about around a year. In Tunisia, several years. So there isn't a lot of experience to go on. What would Islamist groups want to do in the future? What for them does it mean to be illiberal or post-liberal? And I started studying Islamist movements in the early 2000s. I was living in Jordan and then Egypt, and I was, for lack of a better way of putting it, hanging out with leaders of the Jordanian and Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And I was interviewing them and asking them questions about what their ultimate ambitions were. They were, of course, suspicious of me at first. Who is this American researcher and why does he care about us so much, especially in the case of the Jordanian Brotherhood, who no one really cared about at the time. But I was able to dig deep on some of these issues, and from hundreds of hours of interviews over years, I would ask Islamist groups, okay, what makes your policies distinctive? What is it about you that is particularly conservative or religious in practice? Let's forget about rhetoric here. So the more conservative ones would offer up what I thought was generally a superficial list. Some examples: restricting alcohol consumption, segregating the genders at certain levels of public schooling, Islamizing the educational curriculum, but not really being clear about how to actually do that, providing incentives for building larger, stronger families, but not a lot of details about how that would actually work. Those are the sorts of things that they would emphasize. Now, those aren't unimportant things, but they are still more on this level of symbolic, I don't want to say superficial, but symbolic politics. It doesn't actually reorient society. Now, when I would ask the more progressive Islamist leaders, and here I have Tunisia's Islamist party, Ennahda, in mind, they really tried to present themselves as the kind of gentle alternative to the Egyptian Brotherhood. They wouldn't really even offer a list when I asked them, what is Islamic about your policies? Instead, they would offer parables. One story sticks in my mind. I was talking to an Ennahda leader, and he gave me his own version of an answer to this question. He said, well, we're less corrupt. So if we are in positions of state power, then that's going to be good. And he gave an example. He said, take Hamas in Palestine, which is another Islamist movement, obviously a different sort of one. But he said, if you give the secular Palestinian faction, the Fatah party, if you give them $100, they'll 100 dinars. That was the actual example. 100 dinars. They will steal or pocket 90 of those dinars, and then there'll only be 10 dinars left for actually helping the people. If you gave 100 dinars to the Islamist group, Hamas, they would pocket only 10 dinars, and the remainder, 90, would be for the people and for the public and so on. Now, my sense was that he thought this would impress me as a Western researcher, that I would appreciate this very practical approach. But it also highlighted a fundamental weakness of this sort of thinking. It was almost this idea that as long as you have virtuous people who know God and fear God, you put them in the same old state structures, things will improve significantly. But it doesn't address the underlying foundation. The state structures are still the same. So with all this said, we might say, well, great, Islamist groups, at least in these couple examples, are becoming more domesticated. They are being constrained by the state. And yeah, that is a good thing in many ways. Islamist parties did come to terms with a lot of what we associate with modernity, including procedural democracy, not liberal democracy. So that's good. But I do think there is something to be lamented when political choices are circumscribed to such a degree that we lose our ability to imagine. We lose our ability to think beyond the state, and we end up accepting the state unquestioningly. And forget about Islamism or post-liberalism. The centrality and power of the modern nation state, I think, is a problem for all of us, really, no matter where you are on the ideological spectrum, because when you have a strong state, it raises the stakes of politics, because through elections, everyone wants to capture the prize, and the prize is the state, because once you have control of the state, then you can use the mechanisms of the state to promote your ideological vision. You can push that on people. And the state is so powerful that that seems to be the most effective way to realize change. So this is a danger that so many democracies today have, including our own here in America. When people say this is the most important election of my lifetime, that's not a great thing to say in a democracy. No election should be the most important ever. And it's always concerning when each one is the most important and then it keeps on just going. How do we lower the stakes? And one way to lower the stakes is to think about how to have our politics less focused on the federal state. That there is more to life and hopefully more to politics than that. But that would require us to rethink state structures and bureaucracies and so forth. And I'm not talking here about limited government. I'm talking here more about empowering local government, local communities, increasing the autonomy that religious communities have over their own communities, so on and so forth. But that's probably discussion for another time. So strong states raise the stakes, and that is a problem. And what about liberalism? Because that's also what we have here in America and also throughout European democracies. We have modern liberalism, or what's sometimes referred to as late liberalism. And across the globe, electorates are revolting against liberal presumptions, including most recently in Italy and Sweden, where far-right parties made unprecedented gains. And there's a potential that for the first time in the post-war era, Italy will have a far-right prime minister. So clearly people are yearning for alternatives. They're not happy with the status quo. But then the question is, then what? It is one thing to oppose. That's always the first step. It's a necessary step. But what do the ideological alternatives actually look like in practice? Are they genuine alternatives, or do they simply superimpose superficial changes on this kind of unalterable foundation of the existing state? And just to give an example, I mean, sometimes when I've talked to Christian conservatives and even some Christian Catholic integralists, and I've asked them for more specificity on what their vision looks like in policy terms. And sometimes they'll say things like, okay, blue laws, in other words, Sunday laws where you don't have certain businesses open. You kind of encourage this idea of a day of rest. You kind of get back to this religious rhythm. Or dry counties, or reshaping public education so there's less anti-religious theories being introduced to students, whether it's on gay rights, transgender rights, and so forth. Now, all those are I should also say, and abortion restrictions as well. Those are all important things, but they're mostly about combating the excesses of liberal outreach. It isn't necessarily a new way of conceptualizing politics. With all of this said, I'm torn. I self-identify as a liberal, a classical liberal, who's also critical of liberalism, or at least critical of what it's become. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to live under a democratically elected Islamist government. I wouldn't want to live under a democratically elected Catholic integralist government. At the same time, liberalism's flaws become more and more evident with every passing day. Liberalism, even if it begins in its classical form, always ends up wanting more for itself. It expands beyond its original intent. And I think the post-liberals here in America, but also elsewhere, are correct on this point. They have diagnosed a particular weakness in the liberal idea. It is not content to stay classical. But I'm uncomfortable with the solutions. And whether it's the Islamist vision in the Middle East or the post-liberal vision that draws on nationalist and Christian influences here in America, I'm nervous about some of those proposals, in part because here in the US, as an American Muslim, I am a minority, and I do worry about what a theoretically Christian government might look like. At the same time, liberalism is not enough. Or to put it differently, we're not happy with liberalism. There's a really profound sense that something is fundamentally wrong. Epidemic of loneliness, mental illness, identity confusion. And as consumers, not just of products, but lifestyles, we have unlimited choice. But this way of living with unlimited choice is overwhelming. And this is sometimes referred to as the paradox of choice. It's sort of a be careful what you wish for situation. You don't want to have too much of what you think you want. So where does this leave us? Usually when I give talks, I try to end on a positive note. I try to offer something resembling a resolution. But this time I don't have one. And I find myself stuck in the in-between, seeing liberalism's faults, but not really being sure that there is a clear alternative, or if there is a clear alternative, one that genuinely rethinks modern assumptions about the state. I'm not sure we've really seen it yet, or at least we haven't seen it in a more fully fledged form. That doesn't mean that we can't dream of alternatives, and I think that is a positive thing, to think beyond what we currently have, to try to extend our political imagination. And we don't really know what we'll find. Hi, my name is Shadi Hamid. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a research professor of Islamic Studies at Fuller Seminary. My new book is called The Problem of Democracy. It's about what to do when democracy produces bad outcomes. My new essay is in the October issue of First Things. It's called How Modernity Swallowed Islamism. I recommend that you read it, and I hope you enjoy it.